They say the wind in the high Sierras doesn't just blow, it judges. On Christmas Eve in 1878, the wind had already decided that Evelyn wasn't going to make it home. Miles from her cabin, with her fingers turning the color of the bruised sky and a sled full of supplies that felt like a lead weight, she finally hit her knees. The cold wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a thief, stealing the memory of warmth from her bones. She was ready to let the white silence take her. She was ready to stop fighting. Until a shadow broke the mist.
Welcome back to Rescued by the Ridge. Today's story is a reminder that even in the deepest winter of the soul, we were never meant to walk the trail alone. If you find peace in these tales of the Old West, please subscribe and join our circle around the fire.
The ridge was a wall of white, and Evelyn was on the wrong side of it. Most folks think of Christmas as a time of flickering candles and the smell of cinnamon. But on the frontier, Christmas is just another day of trying to stay alive. Evelyn's horse, a sturdy buckskin she'd raised from a foal, had gone lame 3 days ago. In the high country, a lame horse is more than a setback, it's a crisis. She had no choice. She'd built a makeshift sled out of pine saplings and rawhide, loading it with the heavy sacks of grain and flour she needed to survive the midwinter lockout. She had been pulling that sled for 6 hours. The educational reality of a blizzard is something they don't teach you in the East. You don't just get cold, your brain starts to slow down. It's called the umbles. You stumble, you mumble, and you fumble. Evelyn felt it happening. Her vision was narrowing into a dark tunnel. She knew she had to keep her head down to protect her eyes from snowblindness, but the effort to lift her boots through 2 feet of fresh powder was becoming a losing battle. Every few steps she'd count. 1, 2, 3, just get to that cedar tree. Then she'd reset. 1, 2, 3, just past that rock. But the rock didn't come. The cedar tree seemed to be moving further away. The physics of the sled were against her, too. As the snow accumulated on her supplies, the weight increased, creating a suction effect against the ground. It felt like the earth itself was trying to pull her under. She thought of her father's old cabin. She thought of the hearth that had been cold for 2 days. The loneliness of the ridge was a different kind of weight. It was the realization that if she stopped moving, the world would simply carry on without her, and the snow would tuck her in like a white sheet. Her strength finally gave out. Her knees hit the frozen crust of the snow with a dull thud. She didn't even feel the pain. She just leaned her forehead against the rough hemp rope of the sled harness and closed her eyes. The wind roared, mocking her. And then, through the scream of the storm, she heard it. Not a shout, not a scream, but the steady, rhythmic crunch of heavy boots breaking through the crust. She didn't look up. She couldn't. She simply watched a pair of worn leather gaiters stop just inches from her face.
Evelyn didn't move. She couldn't. When the cold reaches into your marrow, your pride is the first thing to freeze solid. She expected a voice to boom over the wind, or perhaps the rough hands of a stranger to haul her upright. Instead, there was only the steady, calming presence of those leather gaiters. The man didn't speak immediately. He understood the mountain. He knew that when a person is that far gone, a loud noise is like a physical blow. Slowly, he knelt. He didn't reach for her face or her hands. He reached for the rope. "The wind is a liar, ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rumble, weathered like an old saddle, but steady as an oak. "It tells you that you're finished just before the trail levels out. But look at me. Look at the horizon." Evelyn forced her eyes upward. The man, Thane, wasn't a giant, but in that gray light he looked like a part of the mountain itself. He wore a heavy shearling coat, and his hat was pulled low, crusted with ice. He didn't offer her a hand to get up. He offered her a reason.
If we stay here, he continued, his breath forming a thick cloud between them, the snow will bridge over us in 20 minutes. That's the science of a drift. It builds where there's an obstacle. Right now, you and this sled are the obstacle. We need to become the motion. He reached out and took hold of the second line she'd rigged to the sled. He didn't jerk it. He waited until she found her footing, her boots sliding on the slick ice beneath the powder. I can manage, she whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood. It was a reflex, the fierce independence of a woman who had spent a year proving she didn't need anyone's charity. Thane didn't argue. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He simply adjusted the weight of the hemp rope across his own broad shoulders. He leaned into the harness, his boots digging deep into the crust to find the stable earth beneath. "You've been hauling this since the flats, I reckon," he said, glancing at the sled. "That's a heavy burden for one heart, but the ridge demands a different kind of math today." He stepped forward, and for the first time in hours, the sled moved without Evelyn having to scream internally for every inch. The suction of the snow broke. "I'm Thane," he said, not looking back, his focus entirely on the path ahead. "And you're not carrying alone anymore. Now let's find that cabin before the sun forgets us entirely." The weight was still there, but the rhythm had changed. For the first time since the first flake fell, Evelyn felt a flicker of something other than cold. It was the spark of a shared struggle.
The climb up the ridge wasn't just a test of muscle. It was a lesson in the brutal physics of the high country. Every foot of elevation gained meant the air grew thinner and the temperature dropped another degree. "Step in my tracks," Thane called out over the whistle of the wind. This wasn't just a polite gesture. In deep snow, post-holing, sinking to your waist with every step, can drain a person's energy in minutes. By stepping exactly where Thane's heavy boots had already packed the snow, Evelyn was able to conserve what little strength she had left. This is the oldest rule of the mountain. The lead traveler breaks the trail, and the second traveler preserves the momentum. The sled was a stubborn beast. Every time they hit a switchback, the back end would try to fishtail toward the ravine. Thane showed her how to use a dead man anchor, a technique where they used the weight of their own bodies to counterbalance the sled's momentum. They moved like a single machine, a rhythmic dance of leaning and pulling. "Keep your chin tucked," Thane advised as a fresh gust threatened to peel the skin from their faces. "The breath you lose to the wind is heat you'll never get back." Evelyn watched his back. He didn't waste energy on useless movements. He moved with a deliberate, slow pace that seemed almost too leisurely for a blizzard, but he never stopped. It's a common mistake in survival. People panic and try to run, burning through their glucose and inviting exhaustion. Thane knew that steady wins the race against the frost. As they neared the summit, the incline steepened. The sled felt like it was made of stone. Evelyn's lungs burned, the dry, frozen air feeling like shards of glass in her chest. She felt her grip slipping on the rope, her frozen mittens losing their purchase. Just as the sled began to slide backward, Thane pivoted. He jammed his boot into a protruding root and took the full tension of the rope on his arm. The muscles in his neck strained, but he didn't give an inch. "Don't look at the top," he grunted, his eyes fixed on her. "Just look at the next 3 feet. That's all you have to win, just the next 3 feet." She dug her toes in, found a patch of exposed shale, and pushed. Together, with one final agonizing heave, they crested the rise. The ground leveled out, and there, huddling against a grove of ancient pines, was the dark, snow-covered silhouette of her cabin. They had made it to the plateau, but the true test was only beginning. The cabin was there, but it was a cold tomb, and the fire in Evelyn's spirit was flickering dangerously low. The cabin sat like a ghost in the clearing. To a stranger, it might have looked like a sanctuary, but Evelyn knew better.
A house without a fire in the dead of winter is nothing more than a wooden box designed to hold the cold in. As they reached the porch, the heavy silence of the interior seemed even more daunting than the howling wind they had just escaped. Thane didn't wait for an invitation. He understood that in a survival situation, social graces take a back seat to core body temperature. He shouldered the door open, the leather hinges groaning under a crust of ice. Inside, the air was still, but it was a brittle, biting stillness. Evelyn could see her own breath hanging in the air like a silver shroud. "Get your wraps off, but keep your wool on," Thane commanded quietly. It was a vital piece of frontier wisdom. If you sit in damp outer layers, the moisture will pull the remaining heat right out of your skin, a process known as conductive heat loss. Evelyn fumbled with her coat, her fingers feeling like wooden stakes. She looked at the hearth. It was filled with gray, dead ash. The sight of it made her eyes sting. It was a symbol of how far she'd let things slide since her father passed. The woodbox was nearly empty, containing only a few damp slivers of pine that would never catch. Thane scanned the room. He didn't see the dust or the lonely, unwashed plate on the table. He saw the lack of fat wood and the draft coming from the ill-fitting window. Without a word, he began to unload the sled. He moved with a focused economy of motion, stacking the heavy flour sacks away from the damp walls. "A cabin this cold will try to eat your spirit before it eats your body," he said, turning back toward the door. "Where are you going?" Evelyn asked, her voice small and trembling. The fear of being left alone in the dark was suddenly sharper than the cold itself. "You have a lean-to out back," Thane replied, his hand on the latch. "And I saw a fallen cedar near the fence line on the way in. Cedar has a high oil content. It'll burn hot and fast, even if the bark is wet. I'm going to fetch enough to buy us a night of warmth. You find the tinder. Scrape the bottom of that wood box for every shaving you can find." He stepped back out into the white vortex, leaving Evelyn in the dim light of the dying day. She stood in the center of the room, realizing that while they had reached the destination, the battle for survival had simply moved indoors. The darkness inside the cabin was thicker than the storm outside. Evelyn knelt by the hearth, her knees popping like dry twigs. She followed Thane's instructions, scraping the floor of the woodbox for any remnant of dry life. She found a handful of cedar shavings and a few curls of birch bark, nature's paper. On the frontier, these aren't just scraps. They are tinder, the delicate bridge between a cold death and a warm life. The door creaked open, admitting a swirl of snow and Thane, his arms laden with heavy cedar limbs. He dropped them by the hearth with a solid thud. Without speaking, he pulled a small, sharp hatchet from his belt. "Watch close," he murmured. "If the wood is wet, you don't go for the bark, you go for the heart." He began to shave the cedar, creating feather sticks. By curling the wood into thin, attached layers, he was increasing the surface area. It's a basic principle of thermodynamics. The more surface area exposed to oxygen, the faster the combustion. He built a small teepee structure over Evelyn's shavings. He didn't use a single match yet. He was building a chimney of wood that would draw the heat upward. Finally, he struck a flint. The sparks showered the birch bark, and for a second, nothing happened. Then a tiny blue-white curl of smoke rose. Evelyn held her breath. She wanted to blow on it, to force it to grow, but Thane put a hand on a shoulder. Let it breathe on its own first. The spark caught. A small orange tongue of flame licked the cedar shavings. Within minutes, the heart of the wood was roaring, and the damp outer layers of the larger logs began to hiss as the moisture turned to steam. The science of the hearth was working. The radiation of the fire began to push back the encroaching frost on the window panes. As the room began to thaw, Thane stood up. His face was etched with exhaustion, but he didn't sit.
That fire will hold for an hour. I need to check your barn. A horse with a bad leg in this temperature will stiffen up until its heart gives out. We need to get her blood moving." Evelyn looked at him, truly seeing him now. He was a man who understood that life on the ridge was a series of connected responsibilities. You save the person, then the fire, then the beast. It was a chain of survival that couldn't be broken. She stood up, her limbs finally tingling with the painful, beautiful return of circulation. "I'm coming with you," she said. Thane nodded once. "Grab the liniment. We've got work to do."
The barn was a drafty sanctuary, but compared to the howling void outside, it felt like a cathedral. Together they worked on the buckskin mare. Thane showed Evelyn how to wrap a leg using strips of flannel and a warmed poultice of herbs and lard. It wasn't just about medicine, it was about the heat. By insulating the horse's lower limbs, they were preventing the animal's core temperature from dropping. In the Old West, your horse was your lifeline, and on a night like this, the horse's survival was entwined with their own. When they finally returned to the cabin, the transformation was staggering. The cedar fire had done its work, soaking into the thick log walls. The air was no longer a threat, it was a comfort. Evelyn moved to the pantry. Her hands were still shaky, but the umbles had passed. She pulled out a cast-iron skillet, the workhorse of the frontier kitchen. To the uninitiated, it's just a pan, but for a woman on the ridge, seasoned cast iron is a prized possession because of its thermal mass. Once it gets hot, it stays hot, distributing heat evenly even over an inconsistent flame. She began to mix flour, salt, and a bit of precious lard from the supplies they had hauled. She fried up a simple skillet bread, the aroma of browning dough filling the room and masking the scent of wet wool and wood smoke. She opened a jar of preserved service berries, their deep red color the only decoration for this Christmas Eve. They sat at the small scarred pine table. For a long time the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic thrum of the storm against the roof. "You didn't have to stay," Evelyn said softly, breaking the silence. "Most men would have seen me to the door and kept riding for the valley." "The valley is for people who like easy answers, ma'am. Up here, we only have the truth. And the truth is, no one survives the ridge by looking the other way." He told her about his life as a drift fence rider, the lonely men who spent months in the high country, making sure the cattle didn't wander into the ravines during a freeze. It was a life of solitude, but not of loneliness. There is a difference. As the meal ended, Evelyn felt a strange sensation. The physical hunger was gone, but the heavy, hollow ache she'd been carrying in her chest for months, the one she thought was just part of her now, felt lighter. She looked at the man across from her. He was a stranger, yet he had shared more of her burden in 3 hours than anyone had in a year. Just as the warmth of the meal began to settle into their bones, the mountain decided to remind them who was truly in charge. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed into the cabin, making the heavy timbers groan like a ship at sea. Then came a sound like a pistol shot. A wooden shutter on the north window had snapped its leather hinge and was now battering against the glass with every pulse of the gale. "If that glass breaks, the pressure inside this cabin will drop in seconds," Thane said, already on his feet. "The wind will rip the heat right out of here, and we'll be fighting the blizzard from inside our own walls." It was a lesson in frontier physics. A house is only as strong as its seals. In a high-altitude storm, a broken window isn't just an inconvenience, it's a breach that can lead to structural failure if the wind gets under the rafters. "Stay inside," Thane commanded, but Evelyn was already reaching for her scarf. "It takes 2, she shouted over the roar. "One to hold the shutter, one to drive the spike. You can't do both in a 60-mile-an-hour wind." They stepped out into the vortex. The world was a blinding chaos of white. The temperature had plummeted even further, a phenomenon known as the midnight drop. They fought their way around the corner of the cabin, the wind trying to peel them off the wall. Thane put his back against the logs, using his massive frame to pin the bucking shutter. Evelyn reached into the tool bucket they'd brought out, pulling out a heavy iron spike and a mallet. Her hands were freezing, but her mind was clear. "Now!" Thane yelled. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She positioned the spike against the cross brace of the shutter and swung. In the Old West, you didn't have the luxury of precision power tools. You relied on dead reckoning and the weight of the hammer. She struck the iron true, the ring of metal on metal cutting through the scream of the wind. 1 strike, 2, 3. The shutter held. They scrambled back inside, slamming the heavy door and dropping the bar into place. They were both gasping for air, their faces plastered with a layer of frozen sleet. Evelyn leaned against the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at her hands, red, shaking, but capable. The storm continued to howl, louder than ever, but the cabin was secure. The internal pressure had equalized. They had defended their sanctuary. Thane looked at her, a glimmer of genuine respect in his eyes. "Most folks would have stayed by the fire and hoped for the best, but hope doesn't drive spikes, Evelyn. Action does." She realized then that the redemption she had been seeking wasn't about her past or her losses. It was about the realization that she still had the will to fight for the life she had built.
The roar of the wind didn't die out all at once. It faded into a rhythmic, haunting hum that signaled the storm had spent its greatest fury. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic pop of the cedar fire and the heavy breathing of 2 survivors. The adrenaline that had fueled their work at the window began to ebb, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. It was now, officially, Christmas morning. In the modern world, we think of Christmas as a day of noise, tearing paper, loud laughter, and clinking plates. But on the frontier, the greatest gift you could receive was silence. Silence meant the roof had held. Silence meant the livestock were still breathing. Silence was the sound of safety. Thane sat back down by the hearth, pulling a small whetstone from his pocket. He began to sharpen his pocket knife, the rasping sound of steel on stone acting as a grounding rhythm. This is a common habit of the mountain man. Even in rest, they maintain their tools. A dull blade is a dangerous thing in the wilderness. It requires more force and offers less control, leading to accidents that no one can afford when the nearest doctor is 3 days' ride away. "You've got a sturdy place here," Thane said, his voice softer now. "Your father built this with scribed notches. Not many men take the time for that anymore." He was referring to the way the logs were fitted. Most cabins were built with simple saddle notches that left gaps for the wind, but scribing meant each log was custom fit to the one below it, creating a vacuum seal that kept the heat in and the rot out. It was a labor-intensive craft, a testament to a man who intended for his daughter to be protected long after he was gone. Evelyn looked around the room. For months she had seen only the chores she couldn't finish and the repairs she couldn't manage, but through Thane's eyes she saw the strength of the foundation. She saw that she wasn't living in a ruin, she was living in a fortress. "I thought I was failing him," she whispered, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "I thought being alone meant I was losing the fight." Thane stopped the stone against the blade and looked at her. "Being alone is just a circumstance, Evelyn, but being lonely, that's a choice to stop sharing the weight. You fought for this ridge tonight. That isn't failure, that's a legacy." Sometimes the greatest thing someone can give you isn't a solution to your problems. It's a mirror that shows you the strength you forgot you had.
The sun didn't just rise over the ridge, it exploded. After the monochromatic gray of the blizzard, the world was suddenly rendered in brilliant, blinding white and a sky so blue it looked like tempered steel. This is the alpenglow, a phenomenon where the morning light hits the ice crystals suspended in the air, turning the mountain peaks into shimmering towers of gold and pink. Thane stood by the door, already dressed in his heavy shearling. The transition from the warm, safe interior to the harsh reality of the trail is one of the most difficult moments for a frontiersman. He was checking his kit, ensuring his flint, steel, and tinder remained dry in his inner pockets. In the Old West, preparation didn't end when the sun came out. The post-storm thaw could be just as dangerous as the freeze, bringing the risk of snowslides and widowmakers, heavy branches snapped by the weight of the ice that fall without warning. "The trail will be soft today," Thane noted, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You'll want to stay off the lee side of the slopes. That's where the drifts are unstable." Evelyn walked with him to the porch. The air was crisp, tasting of ozone and pine. The sled they had hauled together was half buried in a drift, a silent monument to the previous night's struggle. She felt a pang of the old fear, the thought of the silence returning once his boots faded into the distance. "You're heading back to the drift fences?" Evelyn asked. Thane paused, his hand on the saddle of his horse which he had led out from the lean-to. The animal was walking with a slight favor to its leg, but the heat and the wrap had done their work. "I have a circuit to finish," Thane said. He looked back at the cabin, then at Evelyn. He didn't offer a dramatic goodbye. The West isn't a place for long speeches. "But I'll be back this way in a fortnight to check the timberline. Your wood box is low, and that cedar won't last forever. I reckon I could spare a day for some heavy splitting." It wasn't an invitation to a dance or a romantic gesture. It was a promise of continuity. On the ridge, a promise to help with the wood is the highest form of devotion. It meant he recognized her struggle and chose to be a part of her survival. Evelyn watched him mount up. As he turned his horse towards the tree line, she realized that the weight hadn't disappeared. The snow was still deep, the winter was still long, and she was still alone on her land. But the crushing despair that had brought her to her knees in the snow was gone. She had been reminded that even the strongest mountain is held up by the earth around it.
Evelyn stood on the porch until the silhouette of Thane and his horse vanished into the shimmering white of the pine grove. The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, suffocating weight she had feared. It was a clean silence, the kind that follows a fever breaking. She stepped back inside and looked at the hearth. The fire was no longer a desperate plea for life. It was a steady, humming glow. She picked up the cast-iron skillet and wiped it clean with a bit of dry salt, a frontier trick to preserve the seasoning of the metal without using water that could cause rust. Every action she took now felt purposeful. Educationally, the redemption of a homestead isn't found in a single night of luck. It's found in the small, daily victories. Evelyn began to organize the supplies they had hauled. She stored the flour in a tin-lined chest to keep out the damp and the mountain mice. She checked the seal on her windows, feeling the solid work they had done together. As she worked, she realized the cowboy had given her more than just a warm fire and a fixed shutter. He had given her a perspective shift. In the Old West, carrying alone was a death sentence, but carrying together was a legacy. She looked at the 2 chairs at her table and realized that for the first time in a year, she wasn't just surviving for her father's memory, she was building for her own future. The sun climbed higher, casting long, golden shadows across the floorboards. Evelyn walked to the window and looked out at the ridge. The mountain was still dangerous, the winter was still harsh, and there would be more storms. But she knew now that she had the skills to endure and the spirit to reach out when the load became too heavy. She sat down and began to mend a pair of wool socks, her needle moving with a steady confidence. On this Christmas morning, the greatest gift wasn't under a tree. It was the quiet, unshakable knowledge that she was part of the fabric of the ridge. She was a mountain woman, tempered by the frost and warmed by the kindness of a stranger who was no longer a stranger. The weight was still there, but her heart was strong enough to carry it.
Thank you for spending this Christmas Eve with us on the Ridge. Evelyn's story reminds us that while the frontier is a place of harsh winters and steep climbs, it is also a place where the human spirit finds its greatest strength through connection. If this story spoke to you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who might be carrying a heavy burden today. Your support helps us keep these tales of the Old West alive. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a Thane appear in your life when you felt you couldn't go another step? Or perhaps you were the one to help someone else carry their load? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and check out our Mountain Survival playlist for more stories of love, redemption, and life on the edge of the world. Until next time, keep your fire bright and your heart brave. Stay safe out there.